Welcome to the Department of Geriatric Medicine monthly grand rounds. Before I introduce our speaker, I have a few housekeeping comments. This CME activity is sponsored by the Hawaii Consortium for CME, a joint venture between the Hawaii Medical Association and the John A. Burns School of Medicine, University of Hawaii. As a reminder, evaluations are required for CMEs. You can find evaluations by following the link in the chat or at any time on our website and also from our email advertisement. Your comments are very important to the planning committee and will be used to plan future programs. As you know, all sponsors of CME are required to execute a conflict of interest policy. Speakers are expected to disclose to the audience any real or apparent conflicts of interest that may have a bearing on the subject matter. Our speaker today has disclosed that she has no relationships with commercial supporters that could be perceived as a conflict of interest. It's my great pleasure to introduce Claire Day. She is a clinical social worker and received her degree from Bloomsburg University in 1993. She has been on staff with the Alzheimer's Association since 2001. She's the Chief Program Officer at the Northern California and Northern Nevada chapters and oversees all clinical operations and service delivery throughout the chapter's territory. She and her highly trained staff deliver community social services in the form of education, support, advocacy, and care management to people with dementia and their families, as well as to professional caregivers. In addition, Ms. Day oversees all research initiatives. So today we are very pleased to welcome Claire Day, who will be giving us an update on Alzheimer's research. Welcome, Claire.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for having me here today. We're going to spend the next 30 or 40 minutes or so going over some of these latest Alzheimer's and dementia research updates, as well as just sort of some high-level news on what's going on with research along the dementia spectrum, and then wanted to allow plenty of time for a Q&A at the end. So it's a pleasure for me to be with you here today. For those of you that aren't familiar, the Alzheimer's Association is a worldwide voluntary health organization dedicated to Alzheimer's care, support, and research. I like to say we are in this to end this. We want to lead the way to end all Alzheimer's and all other dementia. We do that through our global research program, driving risk reduction, early detection, and maximizing things like quality of life and support. And together today, we're going to spend some time looking at some of the latest Alzheimer's and dementia science, some highlights of early detection, where we are with some of those great things like biomarkers, and think about ways that you can get involved as far as understanding what you can do with our organization and how that works. So I want to start with the facts, and I think these are probably things that are not new to any of you on the call, but it's the reason we all do this work. More than 6 million Americans living with Alzheimer's disease. These were released in our 2021 Alzheimer's disease facts and figures. And just a couple of things that are really important to highlight here. 1 in 3 seniors die with Alzheimer's or another type of dementia. And we have seen an increase in Alzheimer's and dementia deaths over the last year because of the pandemic, up by 16%. Probably not surprising to any of you on the call today. We also know that discrimination is a barrier to Alzheimer's and dementia care, and we are working to try and right that. We see that these proportions reported discrimination when seeking healthcare: 50% of Black Americans, 42% of Native Americans, 34% Asian Americans, and 33% of Hispanics and Hispanic Americans. That's so important when we think about early detection and diagnosis, but it's also important when we think about what happens when we do find that effective treatment. If it A, doesn't work in everyone, and B, isn't available to everyone because they're not seeking out that healthcare. And so we took a deeper look this year at in our facts and figures of these disparities in Alzheimer's disease prevalence and research. And women, African Americans, and Hispanics are disproportionately affected. Almost 2/3 of Americans with Alzheimer's are women. We still don't understand the reasons for this. Current research suggests that there may be both biological and life experiences that contribute to this disparity. And we know that there are racial and ethnic disparities in the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease as well. Older Blacks are 2 times as likely, and Hispanics are 1.5 times as likely as older whites to have Alzheimer's and other dementia. And this prevalence may be driven in these communities by underlying cardiovascular health conditions or factors related to social determinants of health. And so it's important that we highlight the need for more diversity in dementia research. It's important that we have that poor representation of ethno-racial groups in research means that we're not getting enough representation in these studies to ensure that results are generalizable to our whole diverse US population. So as we think about really kind of level setting in the beginning, it's important to understand where, I know this is sort of just a review really for everybody on this call, but we think of dementia as a syndrome, and we really think of it as that collection of series. It's what the person experiences, not what causes the experience. And Alzheimer's is a disease, that biological change that causes the dementia. Dementia, of course, has that umbrella term used to describe a series of symptoms associated with cognitive impairment. And, what I like about this is it really shows that how we're getting better over the years of understanding the differences between Alzheimer's and other types of dementia. We still know that Alzheimer's is the most common, about 60 or more % are of the Alzheimer's type, but we're also learning more and more about the prevalence of vascular dementia, dementia with Lewy bodies, frontotemporal dementia, and of course, making sure that the families understand this. So this is a slide that we would share with community members to help them really understand what dementia is and how it goes about changing the brain. And we also like to think more now, and we've understand how researchers now understand that cognitive impairment really occurs now across this continuum, spanning many years. We start off cognitively unimpaired, but as we age, some individuals will progress to stages of mild cognitive impairment. And this is, I think, an important slide for us to think about in these contexts, because as we think about what's a known risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, and we know that mild cognitive impairment is a known risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, or for dementia, excuse me, we also know that there is great research going on that's showing us how to decrease our risks of developing mild cognitive impairment. And so if we see that mild cognitive impairment is a known risk factor for dementia, it's clear that not everyone who develops dementia, not everybody that develops mild cognitive impairment will go on to develop mild, moderate, or severe dementia. But everyone who experiences dementia passes through mild cognitive impairment. So if we can decrease our cases of mild cognitive impairment through some of these new emerging science that's coming out around some of these cardiovascular risk factors, we will be preventing new cases of dementia. And until that effective treatment comes out, this reduced risk is the most important thing we can do to teach people how to best protect their brain as they age. And again, none of this is probably new to any of you on the call, but just an opportunity to sort of focus a little bit more on the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. We all know that it was the neuropathologist, Dr. Alois Alzheimer, who first detected under the microscope this buildup of amyloid plaque in the brain and those neurofibrillary tangles that we now know as the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. We know what these it was a sort of a scientific revolution at that time, to be able to see this better development of equipment that allowed us to see these tissue staining techniques to identify a change in the brain. And so if we were to think about, what we've learned from that early time of 1906, when we first saw the first identified patient, to what we know today, not a lot feels like it's changed. We know that there are still things we know about what's happening in the brain. What we don't know is why, but we are learning about what may impact our risk. And so we know that age is our primary risk factor, but it's also one of those risk factors that we can't change. We have things that we can and can't change about our life. We know that we're getting older every day. Our knee joints don't work as well as they used to, and our brain is the same way. We know that we can't control our genes, but there has been this increased need and information to really think about that left side of the screen. The right side of the screen, of those modifiable risk factors, those things that we can change. And we know that more and more research is being looked at every day to help us identify things that we can be doing to decrease our risks through those lifestyle factors, cardiovascular health, what physical activity, sleep, social cognitive engagement, and education can do to help us really identify the steps that we can be taking today, until we can find that way of addressing the biological changes that are happening in the brain to be able to stop or slow the progression of Alzheimer's disease or other types of dementia. So I'm going to switch gears for a little bit here and talk a little bit about some of the available therapeutics that are on the market today. Of course, we know that these medications available are really only designed and only approved for Alzheimer's disease. We know that they are sometimes used off-label for other dementias. And they're only used for certain stages, specifically in the dementia stage, that mild, moderate, or severe stages. Although again, sometimes they can be used or have been used for mild cognitive impairment. But it's important to note, I think there's some really important things on this screen. First of all, of course, the last time we really had a therapeutic that was approved by the FDA, other than the combination drug of memantine and donepezil, was in 2003. And it's now 2021. And we think about what's happened in that span of what we've seen go to through clinical trials that just fail to meet those endpoints. But it's also, I think, what's important is to understand what these medications are designed to do and what they're not designed to do. These drugs don't stop or reverse Alzheimer's disease. Rather, they're cognitive enhancers. They're treating a symptom of the disease, but as we all know, not necessarily effectively in all individuals. And I think the frustrating thing that we see from a family's perspective is, no one has that magic sort of way of knowing how the person's cognition would have fared had they not taken one of these medications. And, similarly to if you have high blood pressure and you take a high blood pressure medication, if your blood pressure goes down, we can make a fairly safe assumption that the therapeutic that you're taking is helping. And it's not that simple with these medications. And we know that during the time that the people are taking these medications, that amyloid plaque continues to form, the tau tangles continue to form, brain cells continue to die. And so while they will potentially stave off those symptoms for a little bit of time or slow that progression for a little bit of time, they're really not improving someone's cognition. They're not making the person back to where they were before the cognitive impairment began. And so, I think that's where it becomes really frustrating for families during these times to really reconcile what's in the best interest of their patients, or I'm sorry, of your patients, their care partners. I want to talk about a couple of medications that might be on the forefront of your mind that have been recently or are currently being reviewed by the FDA. One, of course, is the aducanumab. Aducanumab, of course, is in the process right now of being approved, hopefully approved or being reviewed by the Food and Drug Administration. And we do expect that there would be an answer about by the Biogen medication in early to mid-June. That's their latest projection. We have not seen any news that would be delayed or moved up for any reason. The important thing to note about the Biogen medication is that I think there was some concern in the early reports of this trial that it was not meeting its primary endpoints, but it did take a secondary look at some of those secondary endpoints and they found enough data to suggest that in the truly earliest stages of the disease, this has the best potential outcome. I think what's important with the aducanumab that we've seen from the data is that early detection is key, and the earlier the point of intervention for someone who's looking at this type of a therapeutic is really important, which is why when we start to think about early detection and we think about biomarkers and how they could be potentially changing the landscape, when you have a therapeutic that really truly only works in the earliest stage of the disease, that's a really important piece to make sure you have both of those together, because too often we know families ignore the warning signs. People living with dementia ignore the warning signs, and they aren't necessarily getting diagnosed in this early stage. And even with our current therapeutics, we see that as a concern that, if you're not diagnosed truly in the mild stage, are even Aricept, Exelon, and Razodine something that are going to have a benefit for you, or have you lost that sort of potential opportunity? The second drug that I wanted to talk about is really not targeting necessarily the disease itself, but is targeting those psychotropic potential problems that we have with medications, and that's a drug called Pimavirison. I probably butchered that name, but it's an Acadia Pharmaceuticals medication that was unfortunately just last week rejected by the FDA for the treatment of hallucinations and delusions associated with dementia-related psychosis. This is important that we continue to think about these treatments that are for people living with the disease, because we know how quality of life issues truly become an issue for people living with moderate to late stage Alzheimer's disease who experience these dementia-related symptoms. And there's currently no therapeutic available that's been ever tested with the dementia population. And so this would have been one of the first that's actually been tested in a dementia population for dementia-related psychological or psychosis or hallucinations and delusions. And so it's a really interesting, we're very much looking to get the data report on why the FDA did not approve this therapy. It was set up as a trial to look at all of these different types of dementia individually. And so we're not sure what their rationalization and outcome was, and we're certainly a little bit confused, I think, by the rejection of this medication, because it seemed to, on the data that we have available, seemed to show that it would meet those endpoints. So I say that to say that we know that we've heard a lot about drug failures in the last few years, particularly. I think we're all really looking to that June date to see if there will be another therapeutic that we can add to this timeline, because as of right now, we just don't have much to offer for people living with dementia and their care partners when it comes to effective treatments to modify or slow the disease. But I think what's important to know is that at any given moment, research, learning, and discoveries are happening. So currently, the landscape looks a little bit like this. We are looking at about the Alzheimer's Association currently is funding $235 million worth of active research treatments around the world, 39 countries and 650 projects. And the Alzheimer's Association is the largest nonprofit funder of Alzheimer's and all other dementia research in the world, third only to the US and Chinese government. And you can see here that this trend of bar graph has really gone in the right direction. So the slide prior, that 235 plus million, is all in addition to this NIH funded research, which now in 2021 sits at $3.1 billion annually of NIH funding in the US for both Alzheimer's and related dementia research. And this is important because when we think about why it's taken so long to get to this point, we can kind of understand a little bit of why. If you look back here to 2011, when the Alzheimer's National Alzheimer's Project Act was signed into law, we've been able to see that sort of steady stream upwards in recent years. Even in some of the toughest economies, we've been able to see a continued either stability or increase in that research. And that's really important because prior to that, we were very stagnant and we lost years of research of really getting us to the point where we have more than one or two drugs that are in a phase 3 trial ready to think about consideration for market. So it is an exciting time for us to be thinking about Alzheimer's research. And I think one of my favorite things about what we're learning when it comes to Alzheimer's and dementia research right now is how biomarkers are truly changing the game and accelerating the speed of research, not only from a research perspective, but the idea that we could, one day, not too far in the distance, have one of these biomarkers really accessible to constituents, to patients as a way to truly diagnose the disease. And so, we really believe that this technology is changing the game of the field of research. It's moving at a remarkable pace. These tools will change our experience in the physician's office in many ways in the future as well. And while we're not there yet, it's not something that you can obviously go into a doctor's office and get today, they are making a huge impact on changing the research and clinical landscape as well. So, when we think about what biomarkers have done for brain imaging, of course, we think about how the that original, was it about 20 years ago, in 2001, we saw the research funded out of Dr. Bill Klunk's office at the University of Pittsburgh. Discovered something called the amyloid PET imaging. Amyloid PET is now a way for us to sort of see inside the brain to investigate the presence of one of the hallmarks of Alzheimer's. And of course, now, just in recent years, we've been able to see another imaging agent being able to be used through the tau imaging to be able to see those those tau tangles in the diagnosis of Alzheimer's. And I think what's exciting about the brain imaging is, of course, the way that it has that potential future of helping us to think about diagnosis in practice. So right now, these imaging tools are only being used in research, and in some clinical settings if a patient is willing to pay for them out of pocket. But there's some work being done through something called the IDEAS trial, which is actually funded in part by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which is trying to show whether or not having a PET scan as a diagnostic tool, especially for those very harder to diagnose cases, can improve health outcomes of the patient and potentially lead to cost savings down the road. We believe that an effective and early timed diagnosis can actually save money down the road. And I think what's really exciting about this is not just an Alzheimer's Association funded study, but this is something that CMS is really engaged in getting to the answers to. And the original study, IDEAS study, revealed that about 65% of patients who received a clinical diagnosis through a PET scan reported that their health outcomes did improve, that they were able to get clarity earlier, that it helped them to make healthcare decisions, to change the way they lived moving forward. Maybe some reported that they improved their sort of those modifiable risk factors having learned of the diagnosis. And we know that the IDEAS trial ended, I think, last fall or summer, 2019 fall or summer, and we felt like we still had more to do when it came to looking at how this imaging can improve health outcomes. And so soon they will be launching what's called New IDEAS. It was originally marketed as IDEAS 2.0, and I think they came up with New IDEAS to really expand that work, to see the longevity, to be able to see those cost savings. But I think one of the other great things that they're going to do with New IDEAS is look at race and ethnicity as well as younger onset, and include people living younger than 65 in some of those clinical trials as well. And so we are starting to see how these biomarkers can be used in a clinical setting, or I'm sorry, in a research setting that is actually helping us to improve research outcomes as well. Being able to have a simple blood test to be able to truly tell whether or not someone has those biomarkers of the disease makes certain that the people that are in clinical trials truly have the disease that you're trying to target. And 15 years ago, we didn't have those tools. And so patients were being given an intervention based on the current ways that we diagnose, right? Which is thinking about a history and physical and doing, cognitive tests and ruling out everything else. And so it does make you wonder whether or not some of those early day therapeutics that failed in phase 2 and 3 clinical trials, whether or not they were actually truly a makeup of people that had 100% had that amyloid marking in their brain. But now we can use those blood tests in those research settings. And the aim, of course, is to have something like a simple blood test available in practice, right, in a clinical practice, so that we could know for sure whether or not someone had that biological marker in a non-invasive, cost-effective way. It could really change the game, not just for research, but for clinical practice as well. And when we think to the future of having that intervention that might work earlier preclinical, right? Pre-cognitive loss. If you have those, if you know you have those potential markers of the disease, but yet you're not symptomatic yet. Imagine if we had that ability to have a time where we could provide an intervention that could stop that progression from even happening. And so what this really helps us to think about doing is modernizing the future diagnosis. We know that biomarkers are really helping us to do that. no longer sort of thinking of a future where we just use that history and cognition to diagnose, but think about how we can use those biomarkers to shift the paradigm, and through brain imaging, through the biofluid analysis, we know that we know those clinical symptoms can sometimes be take 20 years to actually come to the surface, but the brain changes have started. We see those brain changes that might be happening that we don't see the clinical outcomes of. Imagine if we have a way to intervene before those symptoms actually appear, really will help us to change the way we think about Alzheimer's disease and cognitive loss in general, if it's treatable, right? So if there's that sort of future treatment. I started to, I have a habit of doing this where I get ahead of where my slides are, but here you can see the outcomes of what the IDEAS study was that I talked about. And then here's what they're trying to accomplish in the new IDEAS, which is to compare these 12-month health outcomes in the PET scan versus an amyloid PET negative. Sorry, let me go back to this previous slide, because I think I'm sort of missing some things here. So here we found that the national study originally had those 18,000 Medicare beneficiaries with who had some type of mild cognitive impairment or dementia of uncertain cause. And that aim was to really see if there was an impact on care management and other medical outcomes. And so they were able to see that what they were able to see was that 2/3 of these participants had a change in their diagnosis and or care management as a result of their PET scans. So for people that were originally thought to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's, but they came out with an amyloid negative scan, it really was able to change their diagnosis. It was able to show that it was the original diagnosis done based on all of those previous ways that we think about diagnosing the disease, the history and physical, the cognitive exams. When they actually were able to see a scan of the brain, there wasn't the amyloid positive scan to support the diagnosis. And so this is really a way that we're able to see an improvement in patient care and easier and supportive diagnosis. And so the goal for the new IDEAS is, of course, to not only be able to have these PET scans, but actually have them as a way to not only help guide doctors in diagnosing and treating memory conditions, but also thinking about how we can include more participants in those diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds, so that we continue to build on and replicate the findings from the first IDEAS study in that more diverse population, and really find that way to have that comprehensive multidisciplinary approach to ensure that there's access to high quality clinical care for everybody, especially around those underrepresented populations. And so the plan for new IDEAS is going to be to really recruit an additional 7,000 Medicare beneficiaries. The hope will be that at least 2,000 of them are African American and 2,000 Hispanic. And again, looking at that early onset as well as the later onset of the disease. And enrollment was anticipated to start in December, although a little bit delayed because of COVID. And there are 350 sites across the US. And if you are looking for more information about that, certainly can visit the website ideas-study.org for more information about how we're looking at that, these studies to sort of improve the precision around patient care. So one of the other things, I mentioned about the delay in some of these studies because of COVID. I think we have seen an impact on COVID-19 on cognition in people living with dementia. We know that people with dementia are already at an increased risk of developing COVID-19 for all kinds of different reasons. We also are starting to see some early studies come out that show us that COVID-19 may negatively impact the brain and affect thinking, learning, and cognition skills in people with dementia. And we also know that many people with dementia are likely to have those underlying health problems that can only add to that risk and or increase those complications of developing COVID-19. And so we saw some early studies come out that showed that are starting to show that this is being looked at to find out how COVID-19 is impacting both short-term and long-term impact on the brain. But I mentioned also that in our Facts and Figures report this year, we saw that there was a surge in deaths this year due to COVID-19 or during COVID-19, 42,000 more deaths attributed to Alzheimer's and dementia during COVID-19 in 2020, which looks at a 16% increase. And, it's really hard to think about cause of death and really look at this with precision, because of course we know that Alzheimer's disease and dementia are oftentimes underreported as causes of death when it comes to the underlying reasons for the immediate death. They sometimes bubble up on those death certificates. And so we definitely saw a trend in some of that inaccurate reporting. Looking at what some of those comorbidities could have been. I think the long-term community living, whether or not had played some role in that, in those increased numbers, reduced access to being able to get to healthcare, that social isolation. They're all potential reasons for why we saw some of these increased deaths. And so there's some talk that it could be more than 16% increase. It's hard to really know what those exact numbers will look like, but I think no surprise to any of you on the phone or on the call today that, that we saw an increase in deaths over the last year for all of these reasons, and probably more not listed here. And so there is some early on studies that are starting to occur to really look at what working together with technical guidance from the World Health Organization, what it could look like to track the long-term impact of the coronavirus on the brain. And so the ongoing pandemic has really kind of focus this global healthcare resources in treating affected individuals and preventing further spread of the infection, but there is little known about the long-term consequences of COVID-19. And so there are several research studies going on right now that suggest that COVID-19 is associated with neurological complications. The downstream impact of COVID-19 on the brain is really not well understood. And there, unfortunately, are many unanswered questions regarding what these effects on the cerebral vascular system, the brain's immune response, and more. And so we are working with representatives from over 25 countries to form an international multidisciplinary consortium to really collect and evaluate both short and long-term consequences of the viral infection on the central nervous system, as well as the differences across countries on the viral impact of COVID-19. And so this study aims to better understand the long-term consequences that may impact the brain, cognition and function, including underlying biology that may contribute to Alzheimer's and other dementia. So it's gonna be a study that enrolls two groups of individuals, people who have had confirmed cases of COVID-19 from hospitals that have been discharged, They're going to be evaluated at the 6, 9, and 18-month mark. And then people who are enrolled in existing international research studies to add additional measures and markers of their underlying biology. So I think it is very early. You have a link here to the website where you can follow along with this research, as it sort of is groundbreaking at this point to truly understand the impact on the brain. And with all that, there are more advances being made towards effective treatments and interventions. And so the fight continues. Currently, right now, there are 121 phase 1, 180 phase 2, and 58 phase 3 studies in the US that are currently undergoing evaluation. And this is for both drugs, for caregiver interventions and devices. So it kind of is broad in the total numbers. And some of the things that we're really seeing that are being tested are not just around the cognitive, the memory, thinking, planning, and learning, but also looking at those behavioral and psychological impacts that we see over depression, anxiety, delusions, hallucinations, apathy, agitation, and sleep disturbances. We know that a lot of these are all in different variations of being tested. And as I mentioned earlier, we've seen some recent news, and we hope for more improving news in the coming months of some of these phase 3 studies. But we also are seeing how this need to combine some of these lifestyle modifications is truly rising to the top of, but what can we do today? Until all those other things come forward, the question becomes, what can we do today? And a lot of this data really came off of a study that was done a few years ago in Finland. It was a 2-year lifestyle intervention study that really found that to answer the question of what happens if you imply a multi-domain intervention, including nutrition, exercise, cognitive training, and vascular risk monitoring, including regular health advice to cognitively healthy adults aged 60 to 77 who are at an increased risk of cognitive decline. So they probably have some of those cardiovascular risks. And they looked at 1,260 participants in this 2-year study. Their study looked at an intervention arm versus usual care. And the interpretation was that this multi-domain intervention could improve or maintain cognitive function in at-risk elderly people from the general population. And so since these early findings a few years ago, we've seen more and more of these studies bubble up that look at all of these things individually. There's been some great studies looking at different types of exercise and nutrition. There's the Mind Diet study that looks at that nutrition piece. Exercise has been looking at that cardiovascular. What do we need to do to get that rate of exertion up? That really, and how many times a week do you need that really good rate of exertion to kind of get the benefits of that cardiovascular training? Thinking about cognitive health, we've seen studies come up that show about the importance of sleep, good sleep hygiene, but also the importance of treating things like sleep apnea. Having sleep apnea untreated puts you at an increased risk of developing dementia. One of the most exciting ones that I think has come out over the last several years is the results of this Brent Mind study. And what I say to constituents when they hear this, the results of the study, is that if there's anything you take away from today's presentation, it's that this is the one thing every one of us can do today to decrease our risks of developing dementia. And this is the first study to demonstrate the reduction of new cases of cognitive impairment through monitoring blood pressure. So this is a study that looked at 9,000 people ages 50 and above, all who had a high dementia risk, and they put them in 2 arms: a standard intervention versus an intensive intervention of blood pressure, monitoring that systolic level at 120 for the intensive versus 140, which at the time was considered to be normal blood pressure. What they found was that there was a dramatic reduction of small vessel disease on an MRI for people that were maintained at the 120, that intensive blood pressure level, either by lifestyle changes or by medication. So you could have prescribed a hypertensive medication and maintain that 120 systolic. And the results to me are just amazing. 19% reduced risk for developing mild cognitive impairment, 17% reduced risk for developing dementia. And when looking at both mild cognitive impairment and dementia together, you see that 15% combined risk. And when I showed that continuum slide, and why I kept that slide in for this presentation, is to think about that first little bullet there up at the top. If we can prevent new cases of mild cognitive impairment, we can prevent new cases of dementia. And here we have a potential to decrease our risk of developing mild cognitive impairment by monitoring blood pressure at a 19% reduced risk. And so we saw the results of the finger study. We've seen these other singular studies come out. The Alzheimer's Association is invested in understanding how to protect brain health through lifestyle intervention. And so last year, we started something called the US Pointers Study. This is a 2-year multi-centered randomized clinical trial. We're doing things a little bit different than Finland, and we're having 2 arms of our group, and one is very structured, very similar to the finger trial group, but the other for us will be self-guided. So they're not just going to get their usual care, they will be given the same information, the information around exercise and diet, nutrition, all of those things. They're just going to be told to go out and do it on their own. So a little bit different than what they did in Finland. But we have a different culture than they have in Finland as well. We're going to be recruiting participants from 5 sites across the US, and you can see here they're all throughout the different parts of the country to try and reach that diverse populations across the country. We really want to make sure that we get full representation in this study. And we're looking for people, we expanded the years a little bit from 60 to 79, and we're going to implement a similar strategy. And in addition to this, the National Institute on Aging has funded 4 additional ancillary studies to go along with US Pointer to look at neuroimaging, to look at sleep, to look at neurovascular, and to look at the gut. They've investing in really trying to understand how imaging is going to help us assess changes in the brain as a result of these interventions. The sleep study will help sort of add in that in-home sleep measurement to examine the effects of the intervention on sleep disturbances linked to cognitive decline. We're going to use fecal and blood samples to investigate the effect of diet and exercise on the association between bacteria in the gut and Alzheimer's, and really look at the effects of intervention on blood vessel function and how these are linked to changes in cognition. So it's really exciting to see kind of all of these come together. And what's also exciting is that we're not alone. This is a worldwide initiative now to look beyond just a few countries to really see if we can address these risk factors in a way that makes sense for people where they live in a culturally competent way. And so this study will allow researchers across the globe, this network will allow researchers across the globe to really discuss study designs, to discuss findings and find ways to harmonize these findings from different intervention points. And really, really quickly here as we get to the end, to be able to slow and change the trajectory of the disease will have a major impact. All of the science that we've talked about boils down to an effort to change the trajectory of Alzheimer's disease and other dementia. We believe that if we can develop a treatment by 2025, this could be through medicines or through lifestyle interventions, that delays the onset of Alzheimer's by just 5 years. Then it's projected that 5.7 million people expected to develop the disease by 2050 would not. And this would have a huge impact on our families, on help to mitigate the looming public health crisis in our society. I know I really just skimmed the top of all of the science world. I want to make sure you're all aware of an amazing app we have called the Alzheimer's Association Science Hub app, where all of the latest and greatest scientific evidence can be found, including information from the association and our sort of viewpoints on those, as well as news and other updates. And also to make you aware of a program that we have called Trial Match, which is a way to link clinical studies services, link people to those studies to get involved in research. It takes every single one of us to find those sites, to find participants, and to connect everybody together. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I know you've been going on here, as my mother would have said, I've been rabbiting on for 40 minutes and wanted to make sure that we had some time for questions if there are any.
Claire, thank you so much for your presentation. I did want to point out to everyone that LJ Duenas from the Alzheimer's Association Hawaii chapter has put a link into the chat box for clinicians who may need resources for patients. He's put in a link to download April offering. So thank you, LJ, for doing that. I guess we do have one question in the chat box, Claire, and that is, what about donanemab?
Yeah, I know. I feel like they really are testing all of our cognitive skills with the names that they come up with for some of these medications. And yeah, so let me start by telling you that I've not done as much research on that particular drug. I can certainly point you in directions to where you might be able to find that information, but it's still pretty early for us to have sort of any good concrete information on it. Was there something in particular you were looking for, just to kind of understand where it is in the clinical trial process, or?
I think there's Gary Okamoto is the one who gave that question. Gary, please feel free to speak up. But I believe that there's been a lot of stuff in the news about it going before the FDA for approval, and so I think our audience wants to know a little bit more about where the situation is, where the clinical trials have been, and what the Alzheimer's Association expects to happen with the FDA approval process.
Right.
Yeah, so I think, so this is another monoclonal antibody, right? So it's right now not in front of the FDA. I think they are, I think the last time that it reported out any sort of results was at, was it a CTAD? I can't remember the last time that it had any sort of last results being presented, but my understanding is they're not quite ready for the FDA yet. I think they are still, they're moving now from a phase 2 trial into their phase 3 trial. I don't believe that their phase 3 trial has really started yet. I think what they found in their phase 2 trial was that I think they saw higher cognition skills, scores, a better ability to perform activities of daily life. They sort of saw some improvement in those over the span of the months that they were in the trial. I think that what was encouraging about this trial and its phase 2 trial was that it met its primary endpoints, which other phase 2 trials for cognition haven't necessarily done. But that at this point, we're at the point of needing that phase 3 larger trial in order to really see whether or not it meets the full endpoints. But I didn't think this was ready for FDA. I thought this was still a phase 2 trial that was ready to go to phase 3. LJ, I'm not sure if you have more or better information on that. Maybe not.
While we're waiting for LJ, there is another question in the chat box. Is there a clinically available or soon to be available FDA-approved blood test for Alzheimer's disease?
I think it's closer than we think, but when I say closer from a research perspective, we're sort of talking the next 3 to 5 years. What we found over the last 2 years is a real improvement in showing the efficacy of those blood tests compared to PET scan, that they've matched almost test to test to show that they're as good as a PET scan. I think where we are now with the blood test is really understanding, making sure that they have the lab part of it right. What kind of vial does it need to be collected in? What kind of temperature does it need to be stored in? How does it get processed to ensure the integrity of the blood test? So I think that's where they are, but they're, scientists tell us anywhere from sort of 3 to 5 years before that could be available in a clinical practice.
Thank you very much, Claire. Are there any other questions from the audience? We still have a couple of minutes left. Please type them in the chat box, and please don't forget to put your evaluations in if you want to get CME credit. The evaluation link was in the invitation email, and it's also on our website if you need to find it. And Michaela just put the evaluation link into the chat box too. Thank you, Michaela. Any other questions? If not, I'd like to thank our speaker, Claire Day, and I'd also like to thank our Alzheimer's Association local chapter representatives, LJ and Ivy Castellanos, who've been on this call. Oh, I'm sorry, Michaela just texted that it was the wrong evaluation and she's going to give you the right link instead. But if not, since there are no more questions, Claire, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. We really enjoyed your talk, and for the audience, have a nice rest of the day. Bye.